Welcome. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County, located in Glen Cove, New York. And welcome to our Curators Corner, our weekly program that we launched a couple of months ago when the corona crisis caused the closure of our building, as a way to share information about the objects and items in our museum with the public, even when the building was not accessible. Before I begin, I wanted to first, as always, encourage you to use the Q&A feature in Zoom to write down any questions that come up during my presentation. I may answer them live, or else I will answer them at the end of the program, where I'll definitely make time for the Q&A. I also wanted to remind you of a particular appeal that we've launched in the last couple of weeks to try and raise $20,000 to support our virtual programming for the fall. We're looking for 200 people to give $100 donations. That will raise the $20,000 we need to sustain these virtual programs. So please go to our website and click on the Give Now button and make a donation to support our building and our virtual program. Okay. Today, I am going to talk about a photograph in our gallery of the fire brigade in the Foehrenwald Displaced Persons Camp. I want to give a bit of background about DP camps in general, and I also want to talk about one survivor in particular, George Oscar Lee, who established the fire brigade and is in the center of this photo right here, and talk also in particular about the Foehrenwald Displaced Person Camp. Before I go further, I want to thank George Oscar Lee's daughter, Phyllis, and for her help in telling me information about her family history that helped prepare me for this presentation. I also want to thank Lillian Gewurtzman, a survivor who put together a wonderful exhibit at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center a number of years ago that drew on the experiences and recollections of George Oscar Lee, among others who had spent time in DP camps. The photograph that I'm talking about today is part of an entire section of our exhibition in the museum dedicated to the DP camps. And I should add that it's only one of several photographs and items in our museum from the Foehrenwald DP camp. And more broadly, you can find many other photographs from Foehrenwald in the collections of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., or in Yad Vashem, and a number of other museums and historical organizations. I'll come back in a minute to talk about why this camp was so well photographed, but of course it was only one of hundreds of displaced person camps set up by the Allies in the wake of the war. You can see here a map that shows where these camps were and how they were spread throughout Germany and Austria in the Allied occupation zones, and also throughout Italy. The yellow areas are the British zone, the green is French, blue is American, and red is the Soviet zone. These camps were administered by the Allies and by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the UNRRA. They also received support from aid organizations like the Organization for Rehabilitation Through Training, ORT or ORT, and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the Joint. The camps were initially set up to house some of the 11 million people who were displaced during the war. They included former prisoners of war, released slave laborers, and both non-Jewish and Jewish concentration camp survivors. But they became particularly important for the Jewish survivors of the war, who had no homes to return to, or who had lost all or most of their families, and who needed a temporary home while they waited to get approval to emigrate out of Europe. Many survivors wanted to move in particular to Palestine under British authority until the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, or to America. But the British and the Americans continued to restrict immigration after the war, forcing the survivors to remain in the DP camps until they received the necessary visas. By the middle of 1947, some 250,000 Jews were housed in DP camps awaiting legal immigration to a new home. While they waited, the survivors started to rebuild their lives in these camps creating flourishing communities out of the remnant of the Jewish population of Europe. I mentioned before that this photograph is from Foehrenwald, which became, both because of its size, serving as a home to some 4,000 people in its early years, and its length of service, one of the more well-known displaced person camps. It was established in the German town of Wolfratshausen, about 25 miles south of Munich, in the American zone of occupied Germany. Most of the buildings had been built in 1939 to house employees of IG Farben, the German chemical company, although other structures had been put up during the war to house forced laborers that were housed there. The Americans opened it as a DP camp in June of 1945. Several things about Foehrenwald are worth mentioning. First, it, like most of the DP camps, was initially set up to house a range of different displaced persons. So not just Jews and not just former Nazi prisoners. And initially, Holocaust survivors were not treated any differently in Foehrenwald or the other DP camps than other displaced people. Yes, they were given whatever medical care they needed, but there was no recognition by the Allies that the Jews had gone through something entirely different than others during the war. Planners, at least initially, did not want to repeat the separation of Jews from the wider public, nor did they want to reinforce the idea that the Jews were some kind of other group. Pretty quickly, however, the Allies realized that there were significant reasons why Jewish survivors should be separated from other displaced persons. The document that brought this into sharp focus was the Harrison Report of August of 1945. In June of 1945, Harry Truman commissioned Earl Harrison to tour the displaced persons camps and address if the needs of Jews in particular in the camps were being met. And here you see the cover of the report and a statement about its mission. Note he writes the particular reference to Jewish refugees. Harrison had recently been chosen as the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School in 1945 and had served in several government positions, including most recently as the Commissioner of Immigration and Naturalization from 1942 until 1944. His report, submitted in August of 1945, did not pull any punches. He described poor living conditions, unheated buildings, barbed wire fences, and the continued reliance on the concentration camp clothing. But he wrote of a more basic need. He said, "The first and plainest need of these people is a recognition of their actual status. And by this, I mean their status as Jews." He went on, "Refusal to recognize the Jews as such has the effect in this situation of closing one's eyes to their former and more barbaric persecution." He closed his report with a particularly damning section where he wrote, "We appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops. One is led to wonder whether the German people, seeing this, are not supposing that we are following or at least condoning Nazi policy." One response to the report was to create separate camps, specifically for Jews, where their status as particular victims of the Nazi policies was recognized and where Jewish life was encouraged. Foehrenwald was changed to a strictly Jewish camp in October of 1945, and one which, when compared to the other camps, had some of the better housing conditions in small, solidly built and centrally heated homes. This map, I'll show you a map later. The residents of Foehrenwald established a whole range of community organizations and services. These included schools and vocational training, but there was also a theater, sports teams, a hospital, a newspaper, and community institutions to maintain order, like a local court, a police department, and a fire brigade. Here you can see the caption that we include with our photograph in the museum. You can see also the men in their uniforms, complete with helmets, and the gas-powered water pump they used to put out fires. Actually, both the fire brigade and the police department were established by George Oscar Lee, who emerged as one of the more dedicated members of the community and helped make Foehrenwald a safer place to live. Here you see a photograph of the Foehrenwald police in a formal march through the camp. And you may recognize the figure on the left in the front line, who is George Oscar Lee, the same guy from the photo in our gallery. Similarly, you can see here a collage of members of the fire brigade, and a close look shows George Oscar Lee as the chief. George Oscar Lee described how he started the fire brigade using an amusing anecdote. But in reality, the explanation was tied to a much longer history about his life. His short version was that on his second day in Foehrenwald, he heard a woman yelling fire from inside one of the houses. He ran into the home, quickly doused the fire, but he then found out that the camp had no fire department. Seeing a need, he asked for permission to establish one, which was granted, and he went on to choose and train a squad of men. There's no reason to doubt any part of that story, but there's more to it. By 1945, when George Oscar Lee arrived in Foehrenwald, he had a world of experience and had actually served as a trained fireman himself. He was born Oskar Littman in Drohobycz, in Poland, on September 1, 1924. So we are coming up actually to what would have been his 96th birthday. Much later, when he moved to the United States, he's changed his name to George Oscar Lee, partly out of patriotism. Drohobycz was a city of some 40,000 people in 1930, including about 15,000 Jews, but it was also home to one of Europe's oldest salt mines and had emerged as Europe's largest refinery center. Today, it's part of the Ukraine, but in 1924, it was part of Poland, about 50 miles south of the larger Polish city of Lvov, now known as the Ukrainian city of Lviv. But on September 1st, 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland from the west, followed about 2 weeks later with a Soviet invasion from the east. Based on prior agreement, Poland was divided among the two powers, with Drohobycz and the larger city of Lvov falling under Soviet rule. Then in June of 1941, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union and quickly moved to take control of the oil refinery in Drohobycz. With the threat of Nazi invasion in 1941, George and his father Jacob rushed with Jacob's sister Helen and her husband Abe, who was well connected politically in the Soviet Union, onto a train that took them east into Russia and away from the Nazis. George's mother and sister decided to stay in Drohobycz, thinking that the Germans would leave the women alone, as they had done during World War I, which the family had lived through before. In the end, George and his family traveled close to 2,000 miles east, well further past Moscow, to the Ural Mountains. There, George's father, who was 48, was deemed too old to serve in the military, but went to work in a tractor factory that was changed to making tanks. George, who was only 16, was also too young for the army, and was instead assigned to work in a fire brigade, filling the place of some of the able-bodied men who had gone to fight. It was there, in the shadow of the Ural Mountains, that George underwent a rigorous training as a fireman before being arrested by the NKVD, the Stalin's secret police, probably because of some political differences with his family. When he was released from prison, George Oscar Lee joined the Polish division of the Red Army and served in an anti-aircraft battalion that helped liberate Warsaw and continued fighting all the way into Berlin. After the war, George returned to Drohobycz to find that his sister and mother had been murdered by the Nazis. Believing that he would have a better life in America, he and actually 4 of his other family members, some cousins and uncles, smuggled themselves across the Czech border and then into Germany, arriving at the Foehrenwald DP camp on October 10th, 1945. Here's a map of that camp. While George Oscar Lee had suffered the loss of family members and endured starvation brought upon by Stalinist policies and the war, he had not experienced the atrocities of Nazi concentration camps. He arrived in Foehrenwald just after his 21st birthday as a strong, handsome, confident young man who had managed to survive based on his wits and cunning. He also brought his experience from military service as a leader of men, and he leapt into the Foehrenwald community. This is another picture of the fire brigade led by George, and I think you can see that in this picture the confidence and pride that is being shown by the men as part of this group, a group of survivors. The fire brigade and police certainly became crucial to the safety of the camp, but they also were a way that George shared his confidence and helped inspire those around him. Let me share one other photograph with you of George Oscar Lee from his time at Foehrenwald. This is a photograph that we had up in our temporary exhibition about DP camps a few years ago. And it shows George in his alpine ski sweater made by some of the women in the camp from mops that were sent as cleaning supplies for the camp. Apparently, I believe it was they sent blankets in the summer that were turned into mops, and then mops that were no longer needed, so they turned those into sweaters in the winter. The women took apart the mops, unwound the threads, and then knitted them back together into lovely sweaters. I love the photo because it shows first a young, handsome, striking George Oscar Lee, but it also shows the creativity and entrepreneurial spirit that emerged in the DP camps. George ended up staying in Foehrenwald for 3 years, waiting to get his visa to come to the United States. In 1947, after 2 years of waiting, his other family members who had come with him into Germany gave up hope of getting into America and settled instead in Israel. That was where almost half of all Jewish DP camp residents went. But George held out. Finally, in 1948, he got the approval he needed, thanks in part to some family members, some cousins who had moved to America before the war. And after coming to America, he married a survivor that he'd met in Foehrenwald. They raised 2 children in the New York area and made a new life for themselves. Later, he retired to Nassau County. I should add that in his retirement, George embraced the urge to write down some of what he remembered and published 5 books. If you're interested, his book entitled Russian Saga is a collection of short stories that largely come from his life experience during the war. When he left Foehrenwald in 1948, it was only 1 year away from its projected closure date, although in the end it stayed open well past 1949. As other camps closed, Foehrenwald was kept open to welcome those who had been housed in those other DP camps. Finally, in 1957, after serving for 12 years as the home for Jews who had no other place to go, Foehrenwald closed. Many of the buildings, however, remain. And indeed, George's daughter Phyllis Lee was inspired to visit there. And then, based on some comments she heard from her parents and other survivors, she is planning on making a documentary film about the Foehrenwald Displaced Persons Camp entitled After the Final No. And I'll put in a plug for her. If you have information about the Displaced Persons Camp at Foehrenwald, please reach out to Phyllis Lee using the information on the screen here. She would be eager to hear stories of family members or see photographs or get financial backing to help her film. I'll close by saying we are honored to have a photograph of George Oscar Lee's fire brigade in our exhibition about Foehrenwald and the other DP camps. I think it provides a window into the DP camps where survivors began to recover and began to restart their lives. Okay, I'll stop there. Please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box and I'll try and get to them. I want to also remind you of some other upcoming programs that we have planned. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock, please join us for our virtual chair yoga fundraiser, rescheduled due to the recent hurricane, but suitable for all ages, and I hope you'll join us. You can find a link to this virtual chair yoga and all our programs on our website at www.hmtcli.org. click under the Events tab. Two other events though. Tomorrow, we had planned to have a program to honor the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage, but because of a death in the family of our speaker, we have postponed that by 1 week. So our program about women's suffrage on Long Island will be held on August 27th at 6 p.m. And one last program to mention this week is on Friday at 6 p.m. Please join me for my program, Resistance Under Brutal Authority, Nat Turner's Rebellion and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where I will look at two examples of resistance that were launched despite the expectations of a vicious retaliation. Okay, again, I encourage you to go to our website and see those and many more of our programs that are listed. And once again, let me ask you, if you're going to our website, to click on the Give Now button, please. Okay, let me see if you've got some other questions for me, see if I can answer any of them. What did Lee do when he came to the United States? As I recall, when I spoke to his daughter, he worked initially as a clerk in a toy factory or a toy company in New Jersey, and then had worked in some other businesses all through the New Jersey and the New York area. Another question, how were the prisoners at the camp treated by Germans or those who cared for them? I assume you're talking about how was the treatment in the DP camp. And these were really self-governed institutions, self-governed places. And so the people running the camp were the survivors themselves. And that's why a guy like George Oscar Lee could establish the fire brigade and establish the police department. These were all the organizations or all the institutions within the DP camp really came up from within the community, although the Allies provided assistance and the Joint and the UN provided other assistance as well. But these were not really people who were tended to by any kind of guards or anything like that. That wasn't the way. These were self-contained communities, and they were maintained by their own communities. Okay, well, thanks very much for joining me today, and I hope to see you at other programs in the future. Take care.